I will now turn it over to Chairman Stephen DeFrank for an opening comments and to get the session started.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our first in a long time technical conference here. This conference is on resource adequacy. We have had technical conferences here at the Commission in the past, but it's been a number of years. Many of you are probably wondering how we got here, right? You know, a Public Utility Commission in a restructured state holding a technical conference on resource adequacy. Vice Chair and I have weekly calls, and this was something that she brought up on one of those calls, and I thought it was a great idea to talk about. As we look at PJM's 4R report, the potential shortfall in generation upcoming in now 2029. This is important for state commissions, both in structured and restructured states, to start talking about this. As the Vice Chair points out, I don't want to take all your thunder here, but you know, under the code, we are responsible for safe and reliable service at reasonable rates. That's what we're talking about. When we look at the last auction, base residual auction held in July, it produced one of the highest numbers we've seen since that auction has been in existence. So we have a concern on the rate side and we have a concern on the adequacy side. So I commend Vice Chair Barrow for bringing this conversation up. This is something that, you know, I am the state's representative in OPSI, and this is something we talk about daily in OPSI, and probably pen a letter that you're tired of reading. So it's an important conversation to have because it impacts our ability to bring projects in, such as data centers or other large users. And it also affects what we, you know, our service to our residentials or customers. So with that, I'm going to turn over the chair to Vice Chair Barrow to chair this technical conference. Thank you and your staff. Kayla did a great, I don't know where she's at, did a great job putting this together. Looking forward to the conversation. Thank all the panelists for joining us here today. Vice Chair Barrow.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm actually going to have Commissioner Surface say a few words if she wishes to, and then we'll go right into it.
Yeah, there's not much to say from my perspective other than I appreciate the leadership, the chairman and the vice chair for putting this together, for the help of the staff for organizing, and thank everyone who's here, all of our partners, for prioritizing this very important issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Surface. I'm Kim Barrow, the vice chair of the commission, and I have been worried about resource adequacy for a few years now. When I came into this space, public utility regulation, back in the early 2000s, at that point, Pennsylvania was newly deregulated since '96. Our retail markets were finding their feet. And the one question that we never asked, it was a foregone conclusion, was, will the system be reliable? And of late, over the past decade or so, we've had some signs, usually when the weather really challenges us, such as back during the polar vortex in 2014, move on to Winter Storm Uri, then, of course, Winter Storm Elliott, Christmas of '22. And the system, the electric grid, was challenged in each of those occasions. And what I'm very worried about now is those challenges occurred at a time when we were not facing the kind of load growth that we're facing right now. The load growth we're facing is unprecedented. And I do not know if we are bringing resources on quick enough to face that load growth. So that's why we started these discussions. As a deregulated state, this commission does not have jurisdiction over electric power generation. However, we are responsible for reliable and affordable electric distribution rates. The cord can't be cut between those two sectors. So that's why we're here. That's why we're talking about this. And I look forward to hearing from all of the experts that we have invited who are going to help us solve these problems, because this is about problem solving. It's not just about naming the problems. All right, and with that, I will ask each of our panelists to briefly introduce yourselves. This panel that you're sitting on is what are the right mix of resources and how do we get them online? And I'll start with Dr. Bowering.
Thank you, Commissioner. Joe Bowering, Market Monitor for PJM. Do you want me to start in with my 2 minutes? Okay. So what's the right mix of resources? To state the obvious, but not always so obvious, the right mix of resources is the mix that gives us 8760 reliability. So that may seem obvious, but it's really not. Given the retirements we're facing, and we've been pointing them out for a number of years as well, we need to
Joe,
figure out. Yes.
Can you talk into the mic a little closer?
Sorry, I was trying to get it to. It won't bend, so. Is it supposed to bend?
At the very top it does.
I didn't want to break it off either. It seemed like a bad move. So we're going to continue to need fossil resources. And one of the things we pointed out over the years is that as coal units retire, we're going to need to replace it with gas, which is really the only available fossil resource. And we're not thinking carefully enough about where that gas is going to come from, somewhere between 2 and 5 BCF a day of gas to replace the retiring coal units if they should retire. Dual fuel is also an option. That does not mean we're not going to get intermittent resources. Everything in the queue is intermittent almost, and we'll continue to use and need inexpensive, low marginal cost intermittent power when it's available. But as we know from Winter Storm Elliott and the polar vortex, as you mentioned, it's not always available. And contrary to myth, ELCC, no matter what it is, does not convert an intermittent resource into a reliable resource. Contrary to myth, solar plus battery does not equal a gas resource. So how to get them online? We know there have been a lot of queue issues. And in the queue, we have mostly intermittents. But the intermittents in the queue, in fact, the 90% of what's in the queue is not going to solve the reliability problem. And much of it, when you convert it to what's actually going to be capacity, it's only about 10% of that number is actually going to end up as a capacity resource. So the queue delays cause more delays, and people postpone getting permits. And we believe that what PJM is doing on the queue side has made a lot of sense, but it's not going to solve the immediate problem. So we also support PJM's proposal to do what they called RRI, which is to identify resources in the queue that can be reliable and can be made commercial within a fairly short period of time, and give them the option to come forward. We don't think the RRI goes far enough. We don't think the criteria are clear enough, but we do think it's the right idea. So why have we had these? Why have we had the delays? It's a combination of all the three players, the PJM, the transmission owners and developers, as well as the underlying factors of supply chains and permits that everyone's familiar with. We don't think that the recently passed CIR transfer proposal works to do it, because even if that goes forward, you're not going to end up with the requirement to actually have capacity resources. So when you have new resources, you need a must-offer obligation. If you don't have a must-offer obligation, you just wasted time and effort getting resources on that are not going to be capacity resources, that are going to not to solve the reliability problem. And we also can't tell the degree of retirements. We've estimated up to 50,000 megawatts of retirements. Could it be dramatically less than that, depending on what happens with the federal EPA, depending on what happens with state regs, and depending on what happens with prices? So the third question is, or the second and third question is how to get them online. Well, clearly price is part of that, but not extreme prices, not prices that are disconnected from supply and demand. And then the last question is, will ELCC properly designed accomplish this? So properly designed is a good caveat. I think if we get there, yes, it will. I don't think the current design will get us there, but I think that we need to move forward and do a rethink of ELCC and make it more sophisticated at the point where it really will reflect supply and demand. The goal is not to choose an arbitrarily high price. And, you know, the prices, we've done simulations which show that with the maximum price set to gross cone rather than net cone, prices the next time are going to be twice as high as the very high prices you just saw, twice as high. But it's really a result of that choice between 1.5 times net cone and gross cone. So what appear to be arcane rules of the capacity market have a huge effect on generators and on customers and how the market actually works. And kind of the last point is that we think that fossil reliability is actually understated as a result of the way ELCC works. That is the excessive focus on just a couple of winter hours during times when PJM still had something to learn about gas notification periods has meant that the reliability, the ELCC value of thermal resources, gas, combined cycles, and CTs in particular is understated, and therefore it understates the reliability of the system. So I'm sure that was more than 2 minutes. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Bowering. Next up, Stu Brutzler from PJM.
Thank you, Vice Chair Barrow, and good morning. Good morning, Chairman DeFrank, Commissioner Zifus. It's a pleasure to be with all of you this morning. Thank you very much for having me. This electric industry that we are in, as we are all aware, is undergoing a significant transition, and it's happening across the country. This is not a PJM regional problem. And Chairman DeFrank, I think, listed a lot of the reasons as to why the transition is proving itself to be a significant challenge. We are projecting significant quantities of ongoing resource deactivations, retirements, in the coming 5 to 10 years. We are seeing load growth that we have not experienced in decades. I think Vice Chair Bauer referred to it as unprecedented, and I would certainly agree with that, given what is forecasted to happen in the coming years, driven mostly by large data center loads really across the region. And among those two drivers, we are also seeing a relatively slow pace of resource additions. And as Dr. Bowering referred to, the vast majority of the resources that we are expecting to come onto the system requires multiple times the megawatts to replace the resources that are retiring, given the fact that they are intermittent and their reliability value is not what the retiring fossil units provides. So as a result, we are seeing our reserve margins erode, and we are forecasting them to erode even further. And again, PJM really started in an enviable position from the standpoint of the reserves that we had available in the system than we do today. But these trends that we are seeing obviously are causing that to change and change significantly. Overall, we believe that the structure of our wholesale electricity markets remains sound. We believe that those markets will continue to stimulate resource development and resource additions in PJM as they have over time. But it's going to be a transition. And I think Dr. Bowering hit on a lot of the points that we agree with as far as what that transition needs to look like. But really, the shrinking reserve margins and the tightening supply and demand conditions were made very transparent by our last capacity auction. We did see significantly higher capacity prices throughout PJM, and that was due mainly to those tightening supply and demand conditions. However, also a factor was our change to resource accreditation. Dr. Bowering referred to it already, the effective load carrying capability of all resources, ELCC. It accredits resources according to what they can actually do, how they can actually perform during the times of the highest system risk. And it was a significant step forward in the way we evaluate the resource reliability contribution on a resource-by-resource basis. At the end of the day, we do believe that resource accreditation, as we move ahead, will incentivize resources with better firm capability, whether that means pairing storage with intermittent resources or even developing other types of resources that have more significant reliability value. But the bottom line is we do need more supply. And as far as what is the right mix, I think we need to maintain an all-of-the-above strategy. As we said, the vast majority of the resources that are currently in our interconnection queue are intermittent resources, and we want all of those too. They will provide reliability value to the system, but we are going to need to continue to add a diverse mix of resources in order to maintain reliability in the future. Dr. Barham referred to some of the steps that we are taking in order to get resources interconnected to the system as quickly and efficiently as we possibly can. Perhaps we'll get into those in more detail as we go along. But the bottom line is that we all need to work together in order to really facilitate infrastructure investment throughout the PJM region, including in Pennsylvania. And I say infrastructure because we need more supply, but that supply also needs the underlying infrastructure that makes it available to serve load 8760. And that means probably more natural gas infrastructure as well as transmission infrastructure to deliver that generation to load, again, reliably. So those are just some introductory thoughts. I will turn it over to the next speaker and look forward to the conversation.
Thanks to Adrian Ford from Constellation.
Yes, thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Vice Chair Barrow, Chairman DeFrank, Commissioner Zufuse. I am very pleased to be with you here today. In terms of how we're going to accomplish this, for me, the answer is simple and the details are complicated, but the answer is through markets. Pennsylvania has been a leader in competitive markets. During 1997, you conducted the first retail pilot and still have competitive supply for end-use customers here today. And as an end-use customer in Pennsylvania, I appreciate the opportunity to make choices. And in terms of the wholesale market, Pennsylvania is a net exporter, and I think that's great. But I recognize that as a region, we have resource adequacy challenges ahead of us. Constellation is pleased to be bringing as much power back on as we can, and through the rebirth of TMI as the Crane Clean Energy Center, we'll be bringing 835 megawatts here in Pennsylvania as soon as we can. When it comes to resource adequacy, we do believe that ELCC is the right way to conduct the capacity market. It really reflects the physical reliability that can be captured and harnessed by the grid. And then it allows the RPM or the capacity market in PJM to do the cost optimization. And what that will give us is actual reliability at the least cost. But when it comes to reliability, I split that into two chunks: resource adequacy as well as essential reliability services. And I think it would be important here for us today to consider both, because when it comes to essential reliability services, I believe the energy markets are where that should be valued. PJM has made changes recently to the regulation market, breaking it from one signal into an up and down, which will happen in a future implementation. But there's more to come. We're moving to a net load future, not a peak load future, one where we're going to have a lot of intermittent resources, and the thermal supply is going to need to be able to respond. We need to procure it through resource adequacy, through the PJM capacity market, and then once we have it, we need to optimize it in the energy market through the right products. A professor from Penn State recently presented at PJM some really important work that I encourage PJM to implement as soon as possible with regard to ramping capability. That will become increasingly important for those events that you're talking about, Vice Chair Barrow. So it's important to understand kind of beyond the target interval, which means beyond the near-term anticipation of the next 5 minutes or the next 10 minutes, but what's going to happen an hour out or 2 hours out, and that's very important. The net load future change is going to be less predictable than it is now, and it goes beyond the current modeling that PJM has. So I would encourage us to pay attention to both resource adequacy as well as essential reliability services, and the time to do that is now, not when we find out that it's too late. So I look forward to the discussion this morning. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you. All right, up next, Diane Holder, Reliability First.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Vice Chairman, Chairman and Commissioner. As one of NERC's 6 regional entities, Reliability First is responsible for ensuring the reliability and security of the bulk power system. We do offer our independent and objective expertise to our states on all things grid reliability and security. And that's really our role in today's conversation, to kind of serve as that technical resource. And while we believe energy policy should appropriately consider and prioritize the reliability of the bulk power system, my statements are not intended to, nor should they be interpreted as advocating for a specific policy outcome or specific resource type. I do think a good place to start is, how resource adequacy is studied and what it means. And basically we're talking about matching supply with demand to ensure that the grid has adequate resources now and into the future. In the past, that meant ensuring that there was enough capacity to cover peak demand. And we use different metrics in that paradigm, but of course, now that we're shifting to more intermittent resources that turn off and on more frequently, we need to really make sure we have enough capacity every hour of every day. That's kind of the intent of the ELCC metric. It looks not just at those peak demand times, as we used to traditionally do in the past, but really any time the grid is stressed and really any time that resources are needed most. Now, NERC annually assesses the resource adequacy of the bulk power system, first in its long-term reliability assessment, or the LTRA, and they also do seasonal assessments as well. And basically, it's just projecting supply and demand out into the future. And the 2021 LTRA was the first to identify some resource adequacy risks, and they were surfacing in the Midwest, specific to the MISO region, which is just west of Ohio. And it was due to the anticipated retirement of about 13 gigawatts of generation. Now, as it turns out, the actual retirements have been close to that, about 12 gigawatts. During that same time, in MISO, 17 gigawatts of new resources were installed. And on the surface, that does sound pretty good. 12 gigawatts retired versus 17 replaced, new installations. However, we know that much of the 12 gigawatts retired was baseload, and much of those new gigawatts are renewable resources. So the ELCC is much higher for the retiring capacity, which, it basically means the system is losing capacity faster than it's gaining it. If we want to keep the same level of reliability, it's not a one-for-one replacement between baseload and renewables. And so just looking at the capacity itself, there are reliability concerns. But of course, we also have to look at the essential reliability services of those new resources. And, again, those are inherent features that some resources provide, things like frequency response, voltage support, black start, things like that. And I know we're talking about resource adequacy today, and that's one of the most fundamental aspects of grid reliability. But as the transition continues, we do need to continue to consider the essential reliability services of the new mix of resources. Then the 2022 and 2023 NERC LTRAs found numerous areas across North America at risk of resource adequacy shortfalls. And while PJM, yes.
I'm going to come back to you and let you get into some of that, especially as it pertains to PJM.
Okay.
But we got to finish the introductions.
Okay.
And everyone, it's an introduction.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, Travis Kavula.
Thank you very much, Vice Chair Barrow, Chair DeFrank, Commissioner Zerfos. Thank you for your public service. I know being a utility commissioner is not an easy job, and accountability does ultimately come home to roost with you. So I appreciate you having this conversation today. NRG does many things in the Eastern restructured markets. We're a generation owner, we're a demand response provider, we're a shipper of about 2 BCF a day of gas across the country on the interstate pipeline system. but we also serve as a load-serving entity, a retailer, about 10% of all demand in the Eastern restructured markets. And because the retail market structure is the exclusive jurisdiction of state commissions, unlike wholesale market design, I thought I would focus a few words on that today. NRG, when it signs up a retail customer, engages in a policy called back-to-back hedging. On day one of our service under that contract, we estimate a customer's load, make adjustments for extreme weather, and then we buy bilaterally energy supply that covers that estimated load on the part of the customer. These bilateral contracts are a major source of revenue to our counterparties, the power plants of PJM, and indeed those revenues are sometimes more important, if less visible, than PJM's own energy and capacity markets, TMI being an excellent example of just how that occurs. Now, incentives align already for retail suppliers to want to hedge their loads. The joke around the trading floor is that they'd rather be long and wrong than short and fired. And so we have no desire to financially expose ourselves to very high energy prices when customer load is higher than we might expect. So that's how the retail market is supposed to support resource adequacy in this market. And it's well worth you asking the question, is it actually living up to that expectation? I can tell you from the NRG perspective, I believe that it is, but that might not be the ubiquitous takeaway. A few things that state regulators can consider doing in this respect are encouraging the formation of longer-term contracts in the retail market. It may be worth considering obliging certain loads to enter into longer-term contracts, as certain states have recently done. It's worth considering requiring that default rates contribute to capacity from the demand side by making them be time-varying by default. This is a strategy that would significantly reduce capacity obligations for Pennsylvania or add to capacity, depending on how it was designed. And it's also worth considering whether the retail structure is properly designed to facilitate the entry and performance using advanced metering infrastructure of devices like smart thermostats and other distributed energy resources. I can tell you from our recent Texas experience that we intend to sign up nearly 500,000 of our residential customers to direct load control smart thermostat programs by the end of the decade, and that will furnish a private source of capacity in that market for us of about 650 megawatts, exclusively dedicated to our residential customer portfolio. So when I talk about hedging, that's another source. That's a physical source arising from the customer herself of resource adequacy that doesn't need to be sourced from other bilateral contracts. So much to consider there, and I'm happy to chime in along the way on some of the generation and wholesale market design issues as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Travis. Next up, Margie Phillips.
Thank you for the opportunity to present LS Power's perspective on resource adequacy in PJM, and more specifically Pennsylvania. We have substantial and growing investment in Pennsylvania's electric power infrastructure. We currently own and operate 13.4 gigawatts in PJM and nearly 5 gigawatts in my Keystone state. Our facilities have contributed more than $6 million in property taxes and charitable donations in support of the communities where our assets are located. And we have a history of continued investment in Pennsylvania. When PJM capacity prices were higher in 2017 and 19 to the 19 period, we submitted interconnection requests for almost 300 megawatts of upgrades in Pennsylvania, all of which have been placed in service. And we recently testified at FERC that based on the recent capacity auction clear for 25-26, we're considering another $3 billion on 40 individual investments comprising 2,400 additional megawatts. And other participants have responded to the 2025-26 auction by rescinding deactivation decisions for the 26-27 auction. The ELCC is an effective tool to contribute that values the contribution of resources, although you may know that LS has a bunch of proposals in PJM to try and enhance the application and implementation of ELCC. In our view, if we allow the PJM markets to work, companies such as ours will deploy capital across a variety of resources, and we will get the right mix of resources to assure resource adequacy in PJM and Pennsylvania. There are challenges ahead, Every developer of physical generation, regardless of their corporate structure, faces permitting and queue line challenges, as well as increasing supply chain lead times. These challenges also include regulatory and market stability, which are essential for long-term investment decisions. The recent carousel of rule change, model assumptions, and input changes and the like have created a range of potential market outcomes and uncertainty that prevents disciplined investors from committing long-term capital and prevents financing of that capital. Nonetheless, there is a range of opportunities for longer lead greenfield to shorter-term brownfield and gray market build-out if the market is stable and signals the need for over the next few capacity auctions. Can't wait to delve into this further. Thank you.
Thanks, Margie. All right, last but not least, Tom Retigliano and RDC.
Yeah, thank you. Chair, Vice Chair, Commissioner, thank you for having us. This is a critical issue, and RDC appreciates being here. So the right resource mix for PJM is, at the end of the day, the least cost resource mix that supports reliability and satisfies state law. Part of getting there is that we need to be able to do the math. We need to be able to know confidently for any resource mix, is that mix reliable or not? ELCC is the right tool for that job. Right? Old planning tools had the critical flaw that they looked at each power plant individually. But, Vice Chair Barrow, as you pointed out, the dominant reliability risk we face right now is widespread failures of the natural gas fleet during winter storms. Because ELCC looks at both risk and generator performance at a very fine-grained hourly level, it incorporates that, as well as other risks like the sun going down at night. And it gives us a much more accurate reliability picture. We've learned a lot of things from that so far. The two most important are that PJM's gas fleet is a lot less reliable than we thought. Incorporating winter risk was the equivalent of losing 20 large power plants. All right. It also told us that if potential new resources, nukes, fossils, storage, and to some degree offshore wind bring the most reliability value. So that gives us a pretty good idea of where we need to go for the right resource mix. But the road there goes through PJM's interconnection queue. And unfortunately, that queue has not, for the last several years, been able to deliver new resources in a timely manner. And even with PJM's reforms, which are proceeding successfully, and with RRI, PJM's queue will still not be what we need until probably around 2030. So, the right resource mix. The right resource mix now and for the immediate future is the fleet we have, but with much more emphasis on winterizing gas, both at the power plant and at the wellhead. In the future, we're going to see a fleet that is not that different from what we have now, but with a lot more storage as the technology pans out, maybe nukes or offshore wind, and a gas and a fossil fleet about the same size as the one we have now, but that runs less often. And the challenge is largely getting there, understanding the limitations we have in the queue. That process involves squeezing every last megawatt we can out of the existing fleet, erasing barriers to imports, erasing barriers to adding storage to existing units, especially renewables, and a radical overhaul of PJM's process for dealing with retiring power plants, which right now, and even with some improvements that are working through the process, still allows for a multi-year delay between a plant retiring and its interconnection being recycled. That needs to get to something that looks more like same day. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tom. I'm going to swing back to Diane. And I interrupted you earlier. You were kind of giving us the lay of the land as to what Reliability First is seeing for the region. And I think that's a good place to set the table. Okay. And then I'll move around.
Sounds good. Okay, so as I was saying, the following years in the NERC LTRAs in the 2022 and 2023, numerous areas of North America were at risk of resource adequacy. And while PJM was shown to be in the normal risk level in those reports, the report narrative still mentioned a potential of increasing risk to resource adequacy in PJM, and it specifically said it was due to the timing of generator retirements being misaligned with the timing of load growth and the timing of arrival of new generation on the system. And with regard to load growth specifically, over the past several months, I know we're all talking more and more about data centers. And, the pace of growth and demand can be difficult to match, as we all know. It's very steep when we talk data centers, but, building that new transmission, that new generation can often take, years to plan, approve, and construct. And the large loads like data centers, the planning concern is just one aspect of it. There's actually operational concerns as well. And NERC has formed a new task force to look at large loads with industry, and they're going to be issuing a white paper on that. But I do want to mention also here that NERC's winter reliability assessment for this winter, 24-25, noted there's no expected PJM resource problems over the winter peak season. However, it did highlight an emerging risk, and it talks about the Transco Regional Energy Access Natural Gas Pipeline and how a large portion of that pipeline's capacity is used to serve plants in PJM. And in fact, 20 gigawatts of plants in eastern PA, New Jersey, and Delaware are either directly or indirectly connected to that line. And NERC goes on to say there's a current project associated with that line, and how a potential shut-in of that project could pose a significant reliability risk going into the winter season. So that I bring that up because that points out a couple things that we talk about often. Of course, how interdependent the electric and gas industries have become. But also it highlights something that we talk about in terms of a diverse resource mix. I know that was the question posed here. Reliability first, of course, is resource neutral. But it's not reliability neutral. And, for reliability, we believe a diverse mix is key. Over-reliance on any one type of resource can really become a resource adequacy concern, whether it's a pipeline issue, a wind drought, cloud coverage, any cyber or physical, common shared risk. The fact is, when it comes to reliability, there's really no perfect resource because each one has its own strengths and weaknesses. And weaknesses could show up in the form of a common failure mode. And so if, you have a common failure mode that happens, it could affect all those types of resources across your entire grid, and that could lead to a cascading type of issue. That's why we say diversity is key. It's first and foremost, but also the resource mix needs to consider energy assurance, being able to provide that round-the-clock capacity through all the seasons, and and then finally, of course, the essential reliability services that I mentioned earlier. So again, from our perspective for reliability, a diverse mix, including dispatchable resources, ensuring the mix can provide energy assurance plus essential reliability services. All those things, I think, from the perspective of reliability, is the right mix for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. And as we continue this morning, if any of the panelists has anything to say in response to what another panelist says, please raise, put your tent card up and I'll get to you. I'm going to pose this question to Stu. Once again, just trying to lay the table, lay the foundation. Can you explain the reliability resource initiative that PJM's come up with, the reason for doing it? I know Governor Shapiro filed a letter, I think it was about a week ago, saying that the Commonwealth will work with you to the extent possible to help with permitting to get resources online. But can you just explain a bit about what the plan is as it stands?
Sure. Thank you, Vice Chair. So we are, as has been mentioned a couple of times, I think, by the panelists, we are in the midst of a transition to a reformed interconnection queue. So we realized a few years ago that the old process of interconnecting new resources was not going to work in the future because we had moved from a relatively low number of requests for large generation additions to an extremely high number of requests for smaller generation interconnections. And that just presented problems for the way that the interconnection queue used to work. So we went through really, I think, about a 2-year process in our stakeholder community to get to the revised interconnection rules. So those revised rules included a transition mechanism. And so we are going through 2 transition cycles till we get to our new queue process, which will begin in 2026. And the realization we had was that since the transition cycles only involve resources that had requested queue positions prior to the beginning of the transition mechanism, that along the way it is entirely likely that there are other resources that could come onto the system relatively quickly that had been realized during as the transition had progressed. And so the Reliability Resource Initiative, the RRI, is an effort to sort of merge requests from resources that can get on the system relatively quickly, can provide appreciable reliability value to the system in a relatively short amount of time, with the second transition cycle. And so we have done a few now consultations with our stakeholders. We have revised our proposal as a result of each one of those consultations. Our intent at this point would be to make a filing with FERC somewhere in, I think, the second week of December. And then assuming we get FERC approval, we would implement this in probably February of 2025, open up the ability for resources to apply, and then merge them, like I said, with the second transition cycle in March of 2025, which would get them into the interconnection queue over a year, I think, ahead of when they otherwise would when Cycle 1 opens in 2026. So again, really the idea, and there's 2 other initiatives as well. Dr. Bowery mentioned one of them, the CIR transfer process. There's also supplemental interconnection service as well. We're making proposals on really all 3 of those areas, with the goal being to get resources that can get on the system, can provide reliability benefit from a resource adequacy perspective on the system as quickly as possible.
Thank you. And I'm assuming we're going to get there in time?
When you say we're going to get there in time, I mean...
So the numbers that have been thrown around about the number of megawatts coming offline,
Right.
and the load that is coming online and the mismatch there, will we match megawatts? And will we match megawatts?
Now, look, it's a great question. I don't know how many resources are going to apply for the RRI and what volume of megawatts of interconnection requests we will get. But that's only one step in the process, right? We have the CIR transfer as well. We have the supplemental interconnection service as well. Those are all near-term steps. But as has been mentioned, I think, already by several panelists, the idea is that the market signals that result from market outcomes that reflect actual anticipated supply and demand conditions will continue to stimulate resource development in the future. So it's not a once and done, right? This is going to have to continue to happen as the supply and demand situation evolves over time, so that resources can continue to be integrated onto the system to keep up with load as it continues to increase.
Stu, market signals. So the last auction, it was a shortened time frame. We knew it wasn't going to bring new generation in, but it did stop some closures. Do you guys have any idea what kind of megawatts stayed on the system from those price signals?
Well, there's been a couple of public announcements. There's been a set of combustion turbines in the western part of the system, Elgin, that announced a reversal of a retirement decision. So it's hard to say at this point. We expect that there will likely be more megawatts offered into the next auction than were in the last auction, even before we get to the point of proposing a must-offer requirement for all resources, because I think resources that don't have a must-offer requirement that maybe chose not to offer in the past may change their mind, given, again, the sort of the transparency of where the supply and demand mix is. So it's hard to sit here and predict a megawatt quantity, right? But I think it will be appreciable, and I think there's also the chance for additional demand response to be offered into the auction as well. Again, it's hard to put a specific quantity on that, but this is the whole point of having these market signals out there, is to stimulate that type of supply, if you want to consider all that supply.
Right. And then, no question, just on the RRI, I am supportive of that. We did support that, and obviously that sort of seemed like a common sense approach. I constantly wondered why we weren't doing that as you were having retirements and you have those facilities in place, treating every project coming into the queue as a greenfield project. Just, just questioned it. So
Yeah, well, I mean, look, it's a bit of a tricky thing, just so everybody's clear, right? The transition process we are going through to the new interconnection queue, that whole transition process was the subject of stakeholder discussion, development, debate, and agreement, right? And so the balance we're trying to strike is to not sort of, upend, right, that agreement, to make sure that we continue to get through the transition efficiently, right, and as quickly as we possibly can. But again, take advantage of the fact that there are megawatts out there that could come on the system very quickly. So we want to do both, right? And that's sort of the key. But it's not an easy thing.
Adrian.
Thank you. First, following on Stu's most recent comment, PJM respecting stakeholder agreement, we really appreciate that and take it seriously. But in terms of the RRI, in terms of CIR transfer efficiency, as well as surplus interconnection, Constellation's very supportive. With the RRI, it's really important to get megawatts on as quickly as possible. If we had to wait until cycle 1, on the current schedule, those projects wouldn't be studied until January of 26. But the study year, so the year when they would come online, is anticipated to be 2930. And that's just how PJM's planning works. You could potentially come online sooner with something they call interim deliverability, but moving forward in the study process also moves you forward to the study year of 28-29 and allows potentially for interim deliverability sooner than that. So it's not just getting studied sooner and getting a generation interconnection agreement 14 months sooner, which is very important, but also coming online sooner. And I think a lot that might come from that are a lot of the megawatts are uprates. I know that in Constellation, we are scrubbing our numbers really hard right now to see what we can make sense to be eligible for RRI if it gets approved by FERC, which we hope it will and will support there. Our power organization is doing the same, and I hope that fellow generators are looking for uprates, because I think those are the things that can come on most quickly. For the Crane Clean Energy Center, that again would bring it on sooner than if we had to wait for the cycle 1. I don't think there's that many new projects that will necessarily qualify, and that's why I'm focusing on uprates. Thank you.
Thank you, Marjorie, and then Dr. Bowery.
Might I hijack and jump to something that Chairman DeFrank said about one auction price nobody can build, and sort of put out the lay of the land from an investor-developer perspective. One auction does not a trend make, but it sure is a good start. And, as I mentioned, in 2017, the prices were, I don't know, somewhere $100, $150, and we made 300 megawatts of upgrade. The last year, 3 auctions degenerated from $50 to like $25. That is not an investment signal. And unfortunately, we are all overreacting because the market worked great when we were in excess. And now we're in shortage, and everybody's trying to figure out a way to suppress prices. And all that does is mean that our grandchildren are going to pay for it, because you cannot have new build without letting prices indicate whether it's in the market, vertically utilities, for example, the FRRs, their capacity prices are over $400 a megawatt day. We are looking at other bills. We just saw Entergy announced they're building a new power plant. It's $380 a megawatt day. PJM was clearing at 24. We've now really flipped the situation with the data centers, I think, are exacerbating. We expected a less lumpy growth with electrification. The data centers are exasperating it a little bit, but do we need to see, prices clearing at gross cone of 700 of a combined cycle? No. But guess what? That rule was put in place thinking that prices would clear closer to zero, because at the time in excess, that's what might have happened. And everybody realized we can't have a clearing price of zero. So now everybody's trying to tinker with the rules because we're in shortage. And this whole market was designed at times to put out a higher capacity price. And if we have, as I mentioned, we've got all these projects we're looking at. And if the next auction is suppressed by, market intervention and things like that, we won't continue with the investments. There are other places to deploy them. But if we let the market work, and we do have a trend of 1 or 2 more years, you will see that investment come in, whether it's to maintain existing or to build new. So thank you.
So if I could just ask, and first off, the build in 2 or 3 years, is that too late, though? I think that was the question she asked before, from, when the load's coming online, or do we have to tell the Amazons of the world, you got to wait 3 years, because we simply don't have the power?
So it's interesting because, it involves retail issues too, about how the states want to do it. There are permitting issues. We see what did happen in Dominion, right? They had so many requests, and in AEP, they said, maybe stop. But right now, the load and the generation matching it are kind of equal at the moment, right? You either, the load can't come onto the system because of the queue, so the data centers want up fast, so they're doing it outside. But they're also not coming on, it's not like 1,000 megawatts. If you see the way most of them are planned, they're coming on incrementally. So it's not quite the panic that we see now. Do we have to plan for it? Absolutely. I'm less concerned about the data centers than electrification, because the data centers are one-off. They're willing to pay, maybe you move turbines from California to Pennsylvania to, there's a lot of creativity going on to meet that load. It's going to be longer term, assuring with electrification and things like that we can meet the load growth. So I think we have 3 years to do that. I don't know if that answers your question directly, but thank you.
So this question back to Margie, but also to Dr. Bowering. You put your 10 card down, though. Okay, so the peaks and valleys of the PJM capacity pricing. We see the low clearing prices, and then everyone was taken by surprise with this past auction with those high prices, and then we might even go higher next time. We'll see. But that up and down pricing, that volatility, how can that sustain the level of construction that we need going into this electrified future, going into this data center and AI future? Don't we need a steadier signal, price signal?
Well, I can tell you our lenders and bankers would love a steadier signal, but I think there's a couple of things to think about. One is the data centers are ignoring the capacity markets. They are paying astronomically more. There's a reason why we are all looking to supply them. They value the electricity a lot more than we're valuing it in the capacity market, one. Two is everybody does see a longer term trend. And so it's good for folks like us in the development, right? The long-term trend is we will need more electricity, and that's a long-term signal. What does slow down the deployment are regulatory interventions. And if you look at the past 3 years when the prices dramatically dropped, it was because of the market seller offer cap. It was because of the MOPR rule, that whatever. So it was all regulatory pressures that actually we don't like them, but from a perspective at the time, PJM was wildly in excess, so nobody wanted to print high prices. It wasn't necessary, and we were all actually taken by surprise, right? The data center is so new. We couldn't have predicted this 2 years ago. So you're right, more steady prices would be helpful. The commodity fluctuations are less troubling than the regulatory interventions. But I think long-term, if we let the market work and understanding that it's very unpalatable that we're going to have to deal with high prices, and that candidly falls on your shoulders how to manage the retail rates, and we are not unsympathetic to it, but that is the political reality. It's going to cost us to meet the electrification goals. I don't think consumers are going to be paying so much for the data centers because the data centers are willing to pay for themselves. So yes, regulatory stability and pricing signal for a couple of years is important, but you know, we all flock. All it takes is 2 or 3 price signals, and we all go in, and then we're stuck. You know, so and we saw that in the past, right? In the early 2000s, when everybody responded to price signals, they overbuilt. All of our IPPs went into bankruptcy. Customers didn't pay a thing, and they were bought out, and they're running. And that is the beauty and the ugly of the market, which is we take the risk, we build when the signal's there, and when it goes away, we may take a fall.
Thank you. Dr. Barry?
So I'll get to that in a minute. But first on the RRI. So look, RRI is great. It's great to be able to advance projects towards completion faster. But it's also essential that PJM have the ability to select projects for reliability, and the threshold be high enough. So rushing more solar to market is not going to solve a reliability issue created by the retirement of a coal unit. Neither is rushing a battery to market. So you have to rush the right things to market, and you need to think about that, and PJM needs to have the authority to do that. So it's not like everything else, it's not a panacea. I think it's a good step. The second point was about data centers. So when data centers come and they simply are buying out existing capability, they're making the rest of the system short. So I mean, we have our views about co-located load. We don't think it's necessary, but we do think that PJM needs to plan for large additions of load and make sure there's adequate generation, because it's certainly possible for, I mean, the demand by data centers nationally, worldwide, seems to be almost insatiable, and you know they say they could bring enough demand to overtake the grid. So it's essential to plan for it, to make sure there's matching supply, whether the data centers bring it themselves or it's planned for by somebody else. But last but not least, I mean, letting the market work is an easy thing to say, but you know, we know that PJM markets are a set of a complicated set of rules. And we don't think that even the last prices were justified. We're not trying to suppress price. We absolutely believe that incentives have to be there for generators to join the market and to remain in the market, but it also doesn't mean that any price, no matter how high, is the appropriate price. So the point of competitive markets is, as someone said already today, is to provide reliability at the lowest possible cost. And we don't think that the 14.7 or the potentially $30 billion is the lowest possible cost. Prices need to be higher than the 2.7, no question. Things are tightening, but there are very specific rules that just result in an arbitrarily high price. I was happy to hear Margie say she didn't think she needed gross cone. That's right. So, but you know, a net cone, even 1.5 times net cone, is a rational maximum price. Gross cone is not. It was somewhat arbitrary, put in 10 years ago when people didn't think it would actually have an effect. So we believe in letting the markets work too, but let's be realistic. These markets exist because they're a complicated set of rules, and you can't ignore the impact of those individual rules. And just as an aside, I loved all the stuff Travis said about, Mr. Kavula said about the retail. Retail is super important as well, and we're sort of, you know, not talking about that as much, but thank you.
Okay. Travis?
I can't let that pass, Dr. Bowering, without doubling down. Yeah, I mean, again, to reemphasize the earlier point, a source of revenue for generation investment isn't just the year-to-year, hour-to-hour, day-to-day price signal of the capacity and energy markets. It is the retail contracts that load steering entities enter into, and then which they turn around and hedge. And so, I mean, I'll can use my personal example as a retail customer in Maryland, where I have a 5-year fixed rate contract. I don't care what in my personal capacity, the PJM capacity market does. And just like your jurisdiction, Maryland is a fixed means fixed state. My load serving entity is responsible for buying all of the capacity, all of the transmission, all of the energy to serve me that fixed retail rate. And they do so by making both certain assumptions and by bilaterally procuring that energy and capacity off of counterparties, which then forms a source of revenue outside of the PJM markets for the sustained viability of these power plants. Now, it's just me. I'm not personally supporting the continued existence or the new entry of a power plant, but strength in numbers. And when you do have large retail portfolios serving both C&I and residential, including from direct access or from wholesale standard offer service type products, that ends up being a really valuable contribution to the business model of a number of generators. And we see a lot of this, what I would encourage, and Pennsylvania actually has historically done a good job of this, is trying to nudge retail customers into considering the value of longer term contracts. I mean, right now, if you go to PA Power Switch, there are contracts that are longer dated that residential customers can buy, and those contracts, I checked last week, some of them are lower priced than the default product now, even before the default product has built in the increased price of capacity in the coming years. So would be much better to try to get those customers to shop for longer term products. I can tell you that there is appetite among the larger customer classes for longer term fixed rate arrangements. We just responded 2 weeks ago to a 10-year bid, not from a data center, I can say because it's public, the General Services Administration of the U.S. government. And if we entered into that, if we were lucky enough to win their business, we would turn around and enter into some kind of longer-term agreement that was either contingent on a unit or a portfolio of units to support the continued availability of that power plant. Now, I think a lot of this conversation is being driven by data centers. They seem to, I sort of disagree, maybe I don't know that I disagree with Margie, but I think electrification we could kind of soothe our way into through the market. I'm in agreement then, Margie informs me. But it is these data centers that are these kind of lumpy additions, and there's sort of 3 options as a retail regulator that you have with them. The first is what Dr. Bowring announced a concern about, which is let them enter the market, let them buy energy from the existing fleet, just as any other customer is able to do, on the risk potentially that they're hoovering up existing supply and increasing prices. And the concern there would be that the market doesn't equilibrate fast enough in response to that new entry. So that's option 1. The second option is something that Indiana has just done, the chairman of the Texas Commission has talked about, and that I alluded to earlier, which is requiring these particular loads to enter into long-term supply agreements from the competitive market, in the case of Texas, to supply them energy. In other words, bring your own generation. And the third is to look at this from a planning perspective and say, oh my gosh, we're so worried about system-wide resource adequacy that we want, say, the utilities to enter into purchase power agreements or rate base a lot of generation. That ends up getting charged to everyone, not just the data centers, and that has the same economic consequences, or worse, really, than option number 1. Because you're not even giving the market the opportunity to equilibrate, you're just superseding the market. So it certainly wasn't in my instinct even a year ago to advocate door number 2, and I'm sure it wasn't in the instincts of like Texas, because it's a very unfree market thing and a certain way to do, but I think given the magnitude of load growth, you're beginning to see those policy proposals emerge for bring your own generation to maybe tap the brakes, or at least recognize that this moment is looks very different than anything we've recently seen in the past.
Thank you, Travis.
Sorry, could I just, Travis, in case you didn't get, I guess I wasn't clear, I agree with your step number 2, you were attributing step number 1 to me, so
yeah.
Just let them enter, let the prices take care of it. That was not what I said.
Nope, I would not attribute that to you.
See, I even more agreement with you than you thought. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm sorry to jump in, but just to reinforce Travis's point, because he's made it a couple times, I agree 100%. These markets were designed with the idea that the bulk of trades would be bilateral transactions and self-supply. It was not intended that either suppliers would invest or consumers would ride the spot market. right, based on spot market prices. The fact of the matter is, though, these markets are unforgiving. PJM does not like to see extremely high prices any more than anybody else, right? But we operate these markets, and the outcomes are what supply and demand says they should be, recognizing, of course, we will always quibble about the details of the rules. Yes, of course, that's true. But we need durable rules that people can count on. But the whole idea of having that volatility be possible is to incentivize supply resources to lock in longer-term bilateral transactions and consumers to do the same, because that is part of any good, legitimate risk management strategy. And it is what will allow supply resources to come on the system and stay on the system because they have those contracts to fulfill. So anyway, I just wanted to reinforce those concepts, because I think sometimes we need to get back to basics here as to what these markets were actually designed to stimulate.
Sorry. Could I agree with Stu and also say that the only part of that I don't agree with, Travis, is mandatory. That's not a market solution to make people enter into 10-year contracts. But sorry.
Okay, Adrienne, and then Diane.
Yes, thank you. I'm actually glad I'm following that, Stu, because I was just going to make the point that PJM is the spot market, and I completely agree with Travis. You know, Constellation has over 20 gigawatts in PJM, but we are huge load servers. We partner with commercial and industrial customers. It's our partnership with Microsoft that's bringing the Crane Clean Energy Center back online, not the PJM one-year print. And in terms of load serving, we also participate in load auctions for default service. We do that to hedge the generation portfolio because PJM is the spot market. I agree also with Margie. We're going to have to get creative, whether she's looking at bringing turbines from California. I don't know. Great idea. If they're not wanted somewhere else, bring them where they are. But we might have to get creative on the load side too. There is electrification. There is onshoring of manufacturing. It is not just data centers, but the data centers are also huge demands for electricity, but we must serve it. It's in our national interest to serve it. And we might have to get creative because they don't value power the same way other consumers do. It's not all dollar-based, it's speed-based. And it's not necessarily that we don't have the electricity every hour of the, or in all hours of the year. There's some hours of the year where those additional loads might be difficult. So we might just have to get creative in how we're going to serve them in the near term because we can't afford in the U.S. not to do so. Thank you.
Adrienne, I had to follow up in your opening. You talked about the transition from peak load to net load. How do we make that transition? I mean, is that through virtual power plants and those sorts of things and managing the load of when it's coming on, I assume?
Right, I think.
Adrienne, I meant to come back to that because that was the first time I heard someone say peak load to net load. Explain it for me as well.
Sure. So if you want a real good example, I'd take a look at Texas in the summer around 8 o'clock. I like to watch it because I'm a little bit nerdy that way, I guess. But they have a really good dashboard on their homepage, and you can see as the solar's coming off, as the load has not yet gone down in the evening and the wind has not yet picked up. And it's right around 8 o'clock that handoff gets tricky. And that's because what they're serving is the net load, and it's how much thermal generation do they have to serve the net load, the load minus the intermittent resources that they have. So when you don't have a large penetration of intermittent resources, you focus on the peak load of the day or the two peaks in the winter and what's your ramping up. But when you have a large penetration of renewable resources, it's that net load that matters. What's the peak load minus the generation that's intermittent? And where your peak is might shift in time of day when you're looking at net load versus just peak load. And what resources you have to serve it become important. And that's where I think you need additional products in the energy market to incentivize that, because you need the resource adequacy, but you also need the essential reliability services, whether that's ramping, reactive support, whatever it might be. And I think you get that from the energy and ancillary services market. I don't know,
One
Chairman, if
follow-
that got your question too, because I didn't write it down. Okay, good, thank you.
Okay. Before we go over to Diane, so we spend a lot of time talking about these capacity markets. How are the energy markets and ancillary service markets doing?
We have work to do there too, and it is what it is. But the capacity market does tend to take up a lot of the oxygen in the room in the stakeholder process, and I think, well, I'm not going to speculate as to why that is. But for the reasons that have been discussed by this panel today, I think resource adequacy is probably the issue that is nearest in time to us to make sure that we deal with. But immediately behind that is going to be this reliability services question. And I think, well, I agree with Adrian that the energy and reserve markets, which are co-optimized, they work sort of directly together, that's the place to incentivize the provision of those reliability services. And I think, like I said, we have work to do there. We have a stakeholder process underway. It has started slowly with respect to what it's been able to accomplish so far, but the bigger issues are still ahead of it. So we do have things that we need to do there to make those markets work better.
Okay. Thank you. Yes.
I just had a follow-up for Stu. It was one of the things that we've advocated for, or some have advocated for, and obviously, and Dr. Bowering brought it up, and I believe PJM is against this, but I just wanted to walk through it. Requiring all resources to bid in. What would you say the issue with that is?
Yeah, we're not against it per se. However, there's a couple different ways to approach it, right? So for right now, we have an annual capacity product, and the resources that don't have a must-offer requirement today don't perform the same in all times of the year, primarily summer and winter, right? And so we could address that by going to a more granular time step in the capacity market, like a seasonal approach, and then require all resources to offer what they can provide in each one of those seasons. That's one approach. I think the other thing we need to look at, and this is probably where we have some disagreement with the market monitor, is the market seller offer cap rules and whether and how resources can incorporate the risk of taking on a capacity obligation in their capacity market offer. And so we need to make sure that we address that as well. So we are actually initiating a stakeholder discussion on that in December with the idea that maybe by the spring we can get to the point of filing something, even under the current annual process, on the must-offer requirement, because we do agree it needs to be addressed. And then in the longer term, a seasonal approach might be the way to go.
So, but where's that line? I mean, because reliability of all sources are different. I mean, when you look at nuclear to get natural gas, and you look at natural gas in summertime compared to the wintertime. That's why I believe we advocated here for a seasonality approach because of those things. Where is the line, though, where you guys say, okay, you guys don't have to bid in, you guys do have to bid in?
Well, yeah, I think the ELCC handles anything other than intermittent resources very well. And so resources are accredited on the basis of what they can provide during those hours of most risk. It doesn't align, and Dr. Bowling brought this up, it doesn't align quite as well with intermittent resources. Solar is probably the prime example, where a solar resource might have a 7 or 10 or 13% ELCC value, but it can provide zero output before the sun comes up on a winter morning when you tend to peak in the winter, right? So the line right now is at the intermittent resources, and I think these issues are solvable. I just don't think it's as simple as just make a must-offer requirement now without addressing some of these other things.
Okay, so I've been holding off Diane. You're next. Then Tom, Travis. We're going to work our way this way. Okay.
Thank you, Vice Chair. And just some thoughts. I mean, a lot has just been said here, and staying within my lane of reliability. We had a few people talk about Pennsylvania being a net exporter, and that is very true. 48,000 megawatts of capacity, peak load about 30,000. However, I will caution a little bit there that the projected growth rate at 0.4% is kind of low, and as we've seen, can change rapidly with data centers, electrification, even hydrogen here. Retirements, about just under 6,200 megawatts retired in the past 10 years, and almost 12,000 megawatts added, mostly natural gas, which is, not what we typically see. Many states that we talk to do not generate enough electricity for their customers. So that's all good. But of course, we are an interconnected grid, and electricity does not care about state boundaries. And so PJM, their estimates of 40,000 megawatts of growth by 2039 and 40,000 megawatts of retirements by 2030. Extremely formidable numbers. 38,000 megawatts of generation have cleared the queue, but not to pile on there, let's not forget that those resources by and large don't offer the same level of reliability as some of the retired generation. So load growth also very much a concern from our perspective. And, in specific, of course, we talked a lot about the data centers, and if we even go a step further and consider the data center co-locations, I think that trend could possibly accelerate the already very concerning pace of change. When we first started talking to states about the reliability concerns we have around the transition, we talked about pace of change and how that must be managed from a reliability standpoint. However, if that data center load can be served more quickly with a behind-the-meter connection than it would have otherwise been served with a traditional transmission interconnection, certainly the pace of change, really could accelerate. And I just wanted to make that, as a concern, that's something that we are definitely watching. So, thank you.
Diane, just as a follow-up, in your opening comments, or one of them, you were talking about diversity being key, diversity mix, and do you think we're heavy on natural gas here? I mean, we're over 60%, I think, generation by natural gas in the Commonwealth. What's your thoughts?
I think it's great. Again, as I said, diversity is key because you could, there's no perfect resource. All of them have their own strengths and weaknesses, and you don't want to get over-reliant on any one resource. They all have something to offer. You want to avoid a common failure mode kind of situation where all the experience, all the natural gas plants are affected by a cyber security risk, for example. You wouldn't want too much in one basket, so to speak. You want to have enough resources to kind of, navigate through any type of common failure mode concern that you would have. So, thank you.
Okay, Tom.
Yeah, thank you. First, just briefly reply to Stu's comment about ELCC and intermittence. I think we would disagree on that, and actually one of the main attractions of ELCC for NRDC was that it accurately reflects the reliability value of renewables, even if that does end up being very low. So, for instance, Stu had mentioned solar has like a 7 to 14% ELCC. That reflects the reality that if you add, about 12 megawatts of solar, that's the equivalent of 1 megawatt of fossil, and so that having 12 extra megawatts during the daytime reduces your risk as much as having 1 megawatt year-round. Right, because reliability is a statistical thing, always has been, always will be, and it's about reducing the risk over the whole year. Right now, RPM treats all outages as equal. That may be we may want to call that into question. I tend to personally think a winter blackout is a lot more dangerous than a summer one, and so we could start reflecting those things. But the reason we liked ELCC is because it allows renewables to replace traditional generation as fast as it can, but no faster, and we think it maintains that. But now to the question about the must-offer requirement, we agree the must-offer exception needs to go, right? Every resource needs to be required to offer. DR has some special problems, but supply-side generation. The must-offer exception was a negotiated compromise because right now the capacity market requires intermittence and storage to deliver things they aren't getting paid for, right? Solar is valued because of the value of daytime power, which may be quite low, but that's what it's getting paid for. So it's unreasonable to penalize it at night. A battery is paid for the value of 4 hours of storage, but they can face a penalty in hour 5. Right, so eliminating the must-offer goes hand in hand with only require resources to deliver the services they're getting paid for. Take care of that, the must-offer problem goes away.
Thank you. Marjorie?
So I have to say, I think, just responding to Tom quickly, that shows why perhaps intermittent should not be receiving the same capacity payments, because they are very limited, whereas I, with my gas generators, have to bid in every hour, and I do get PAIs, even when the gas companies breach their obligation to me, which happened in Winter Storm Elliott, and I bore the hundreds of millions of dollars of penalties. So it is a different game. But I actually wanted to go to two things. One is Dr. Bowring's co-located load, whether it's behind the meter or in front of the meter or behind the meter, the load is coming. So it's going to impact consumers whether it's in front or behind, and then we can argue about the costs of who pays the transmission, and there's a lot of hair there, which I'll avoid. But I did want to go to the energy and gas electric, because that's really, really important, and we haven't gotten it right yet. When we have the major problems, they are often on a weekend or, over worse, a holiday weekend. And you cannot expect us to go out and spend millions of dollars getting gas only to be told, haha, the weather didn't come in, go and sell it, and don't get any money for it. It doesn't give us the financial, it's not the risk reward that anyone would take. So there are ways to address it that LS have suggested to PJM and continue to push for, which is like a Friday option product, where you option whether we have to be available over the weekend, and then we better go out and buy the gas if our the options exercise. So there are products out there. More importantly, what can you do as the PAPUC as the load becomes more electrified? There is room for the EDCs to release some of the gas that gets caught up during the cold, right? They have to be very conservative, right? If their customers lose heating, they're in big trouble. But there is often, we have noticed, excess on the system that there's a reluctance to release because they're penalized if they go short. There's no benefit to them if they sell the gas out there. So it's something you can keep an eye out on to see if the EDCs, if you have the right resource consumption and mix, and work with them to ensure that gas gets released into the wholesale market if they don't need it.
You're referring to gas systems, though,
yes,
right?
Yes.
Not electric.
No, but it's the gas systems to release the gas to the electric wholesale units, yes. And right now, there may not be a huge opportunity, but as we electrify more and there's less consumption of gas to heat homes and there's more electrification, it may be an opportunity for you to work with your local gas companies to see if more gas can be released efficiently into the wholesale market for the gas units to run.
I think that's a good suggestion. And I think right now the problem is there's not a whole lot of transparency into how much they may be holding during a particular event. So it is something to look into. Thank you for that. Travis?
Just coming back to your question, Vice Chair Barrow, on the energy markets, the bilateral energy markets, the ability of someone to go out and purchase forward energy are still very liquid in PJM. I can turn around and tomorrow enter into a contract through 2030 to supply myself energy supply. And interestingly, and this kind of runs counter to the observations about significant load growth, the forward energy prices are down from the beginning of the year. So it would have cost me more at the beginning of the year to buy 2029, 2030 energy, and now those prices have declined. And candidly, I don't know why that is. I mean, it could be that some of the data center load publicity has backed off a little bit. It could be an assumption that these energy markets will achieve the kind of door number one equilibrium in the fullness of time, but it is nevertheless what energy is trading at right now. And the other alternative is, in this sort of balkanized energy and capacity market framework, a lot of the pricing activity could be pushed to capacity, where we have seen a decline in liquidity after the most recent capacity auction, again, for bilateral purchases. People, understandably, if you're a generator, you're holding tight your capacity for exposure in the next auction. If you're a buyer, you might balk at paying, the same high price you did last year or that the market printed at when you think that regulatory change is going to cause that price to go down. And when you're buying, there's been more consistency in the design of the energy market, the spot energy markets at PJM, which propagates into that forward signal, than there has with the rule change merry-go-round in the capacity market, where anytime you buy a megawatt day of capacity in the open bilateral market, you're making half your bet based on fundamentals and half your bet based on what PJM, the IMM, FERC, the stakeholders are going to do. So that I think, if you want a more healthy bilateral market, there needs to kind of be an understanding of the prioritization and the timing of some of these changes to be phased in.
Thank you. All right, Adrian.
Thank you. I want to circle back to requiring all units to offer into the capacity market. It was mentioned the market seller offer cap needs to be adjusted. Basically, what that means is we can't be forced to offer in at zero. If you have a hydro unit and just say you have to offer in at zero, I can tell you the risk associated with offering 100 megawatts of hydro is not zero. But also, the risk varies by megawatt. And what I mean by that is the first megawatt we produce has less risk than the 100th megawatt we produce. Because if we've had 30 days of drought, we're probably not able to produce that 100th megawatt. We can produce the first megawatt, but not the last, because it depends on our water levels. So it's really important to address the market seller offer cap so we can reflect our risk, but also so we can segment that risk and say what the risk is associated with the first megawatt versus the last megawatt. Thank you.
I think that some of the pushback on that market seller offer cap that you've heard from load interest has been, okay, these are competitive markets, and once the country in large part deregulated, risk went with the generators, right? And now you're trying to price that risk back in as though you were vertically integrated. And I might be oversimplifying the reason why it was a bit of a knee-jerk reaction from load interest to say, no, this is just a bridge too far. Like we actually were ready to throw down on that one issue. I'm not sure. But do you understand what I'm saying?
I understand where you're coming from. I don't see it the same way.
Right.
The risk is on us to manage, but it doesn't cost $0 to manage it. And so we have to be able to price that in.
Thank you. Dr. Bowering.
So I haven't said market power all day.
Is it time?
Right, so I just said it. So market seller offer caps come up a few times now. So market seller offer caps are in the market in order to prevent the exercise of market power in order to maintain competitive outcomes, which you need because we don't have a perfectly competitive structure. So, but going all the way back to the must offer. Capacity market is a must-buy, must-sell market. It doesn't work if you only have one side. If I have to buy and you don't have to sell, that's clearly asymmetric. The reverse would be asymmetric as well. The problem is that as we have more and more intermittence, and intermittence, as Adrian pointed out, include pumped hydro, run-of-river hydro, and other forms of hydro. As you have more and more intermittence, that gets to be a larger piece of the market, and the asymmetry grows. So it's effectively allowing a big hunk of supply to withhold, whether it's for market power purposes or not, which has the same effect. It raises the price and also makes it potentially extremely volatile as they choose to come or go. So there's absolutely it is actually simple to impose a must-offer obligation on everybody. Does not require the market seller offer cap to go up, but it does require, as Tom said, and I agree, that we recognize the reality of ELCC, which is that solar cannot produce in the middle of the night, should not be expected to, and should not be penalized when it doesn't. That just doesn't make sense. But it illustrates some of the flaws in what appears to be the nice ELCC design. If ELCC doesn't work for intermittence, then who does it work for? As Tom said, that was the whole point of introducing ELCC, was to value intermittence. 1,000 megawatts of solar, 1,000,000 megawatts of solar is never going to equal the gas plant. Just never is going to. So that has to be recognized when you're thinking about bringing new resources on, when you're thinking about reliability. But the fact that, and the primary reason I hear that the must offer can't apply to solar is because, well, we penalize them when they're not there in the middle of the night. Well, don't do that. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. They're not going to be there. That's what ELCC is supposed to reflect. The fact that you do that means you still believe that ELCC translates a solar resource into a tenth of a gas resource when it doesn't. So the must offer obligation is key. It's not that complicated. It should be done.
Before we go to Margie and then Tom, would going to a seasonal market help?
I think a seasonal market would be worse than the annual market. I think we should go all the way. Who knows what a season is? I mean, seasons are arbitrary. Like, is it summer and winter, summer, winter, fall, spring? You know, maybe more seasons. There's no reason not to go to pure hourly. Doesn't mean you clear hourly pricing. But if you look at what the offer cap was for the seasonal market, it's twice as high as it was for the regular market. Twice as high. So the seasonal market introduces complexity that's thus not necessary. Look at the actual availability of resources hour by hour. Run the market that way so you clear, so you're reliable in every hour. And pay people in real time when they're available and don't pay when they're not. It's a pretty straightforward solution. We advanced that in the CIFP process. I think seasonal would be a terrible idea, and it would make things more complicated unnecessarily. But the idea of more granularity is exactly right, temporal granularity. Let's just go to the hourly level. We have 8,760 hours in 3 out of every 4 years. Let's recognize that reality about supply and demand.
Thank you. Margie?
Yep, a couple of things. One is I just wanted to highlight something that Dr. Bowering said about the intermittent, and that is the performance pressure on particularly peaking plants and even our combined cycles has become much greater because the more intermittent penetration, they go on and off the system more unexpectedly. And so we are being called on to ramp up quicker and more frequently and sort of when we don't expect. So that is a changing dynamic and kind of goes to what Adrian was talking about. If I can't do it in that hour when I'm suddenly dispatched, I get a penalty. But then there was seasonal, right? I know this is really important, sorry. The problem with seasonal, so you've got one market that's been doing it forever, which is New York. And it's a completely different structure so if PJM were to go that way, there's the whole way they do load forecast. The problem with Dr. Bowering's hourly is, frankly, that would not be very helpful to our financing and lenders. And basically, that makes it an energy-only market if you put it hourly, because really you're piling on the capacity and energy. And we know that doesn't work because folks don't want to see the market price go to Texas markets in an hour. And that's really why we have the capacity market, because there was a distaste for letting the energy market reflect true scarcity. The major problem with seasonal, from our perspective, is we have an annual revenue requirement. And it doesn't matter, how many ways you split this baby. At the end of the year, for us to keep the unit around and bidding it in is an annual requirement. And it seems to get very complicated when you start saying in a seasonal, well, I'm going to pay these there's going to be more resources bidding in here, that's going to lower prices, so then I have to make it up to you in this season. It just brings a whole level of complication when at the end of the year, what you want is reliability for the year. And it is to accommodate seasonal resources that perform better, wind in the winter. But those resources are not as dependent on the capacity market. They have renewable credits and things like that. And so it's really important to recognize that the resources that do depend on the capacity market do have an annual revenue requirement, and they depend on the capacity market. They don't get REX credits and other things to meet their financial obligations.
Tom?
Yeah, thank you. Just a few things. It's important to remember the reason we introduced ELCC was so we could handle the risk of winter gas failures, right? That was the motivation. The renewables was kind of a side benefit. But then you're hearing, I think, different stories from Dr. Bauer and myself about how renewables fit in the capacity market. I think that reflects an underlying disagreement on what the market's for. My understanding is that Dr. Bauer sees the capacity, a megawatt of capacity is reflecting a commitment to deliver a megawatt of energy 8760, whether you need it or not. And we see a megawatt of capacity as reducing the risk of blackouts by a certain little quantum. And the point of ELCC is to mean that a megawatt from any resource gives you that same little quantum of reliability benefits. I think the things we're saying are each consistent with our assumptions about what capacity is, and I'll leave it to you to make the commission's decisions on what is most important for the capacity market. But ours is reliability-based, his is energy-based, is I think the differences we're seeing.
Okay. All right, Adrian?
Yeah, I'll just agree with Tom and Margie. I don't think an hourly capacity market is appropriate. It doesn't reflect the varying risk throughout the year. It assumes that the risk is the same in every hour, and a beautiful spring day is a very different risk than a winter day when the temperature dropped 20 degrees in a couple hours. So I'm sure Joe has something to say about that. But
when I was walking over here this morning, I realized, oh, sorry, Chairman.
Go ahead.
So when I was walking over here this morning, I realized it was not a beautiful spring day. So, no, but I think you misunderstand the hourly. I mean, it's exactly the opposite of what you said. Of course, it accounts for the conditions in every single hour. That's the point. It recognizes the difference between a warm spring day and a cold spring day, a hot winter day and a cold winter day. And it's not pricing hourly, Margie. It's not pricing hourly. It's still, I totally agree, it's an annual construct, but you have to assign the risk of unreliability hour by hour and therefore and match it to the generation, as Tom said, that's available hour by hour. That's what really happens in the system, except it's even more granular than hourly, but that's as granular as it's probably straightforward enough to do now. But it's about doing what we want to do. It's matching the actual generation availability to the actual loads, recognizing the differences between every hour. That's the whole point. Sorry for rambling on.
Madam Vice Chair.
Commissioner Surface.
I want to be cognizant of time. I want to stay on time, and I want to go back to your original comments, your remarks about how you want to talk about solutions, right? So I want to give everyone some time to talk about what these solutions could be. I heard some from Marjorie when we talked about permit reform and some considerations on gas purchases. I heard some lessons learned from Texas, from Travis, and some barriers that need to be removed from Tom when we're talking about the queue. But if we could talk about possible solutions to some of these issues we've been talking about during this time, including specific PA-PUC considerations that could be made. We already heard some from Marjorie. I'll even make this a little bit more complicated and ask if we need to or should build more nuclear. Thank you.
All right. We are going to, who wants to start? Either Tom or. All right, Dr. Bowering, we're going to start with you. We're just going to go all the way around.
All right, so I was hoping to go last on the solution so I could play off everyone else's, but no, so we have to, I mean, RR is part of it, right? I mean, they're just straightforward pragmatic things that are happening right now. RR is part of it, allow units that are available to get to the front of the queue to actually be built. I think stable market design, stable prices, not too low, not too high, but as Goldilocks learned, just right. But to reflect the actual supply and demand fundamentals, ELCC needs to be evolved so it's actually doing what it was intended to do along the lines of what I said with hourly. I think when we're bringing data centers on, bringing large amounts of load that are identifiable, I go with Travis option number 2, bring your own generation, whether it's the same company or in concert with a generator. If we're bringing on those large amounts of load, it has to be planned for. It's not incremental like electrification. It actually has to be planned for. those kind of lumpy things. And we need to finally, in part of stability, get as best we can the capacity market rules over the next 18 months or so as correct and stable as possible, so everyone doesn't have to look forward to changing it radically every 3 years as we've been on the cycle of doing. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, Stu.
Yeah, I actually agree with what Joe said there, as far as the things that he sort of ticked off on his list. I think from the state of Pennsylvania viewpoint, maybe, I think, and I'm not saying Pennsylvania is doing this, we need to be careful that we're not sort of pushing resources off the system due to, policy considerations before there are resources on the system that can replace the reliability value that those resources provide. So that's sort of near-term thinking, I think. But then we need to, again, facilitate an environment that that is supportive of investment in the infrastructure we're going to need in order to bring resources onto the system. And I think somebody mentioned the fact that as these large data centers come online, we are going to need incremental supply to serve them. And how that happens, I hope, is the result of the outcomes of the competitive market, because I do think that results in the lowest reasonable cost to the load, but that is actually absolutely going to need to happen. So those are just a few high-level things.
Okay, Adrian.
Thank you. I agree with both what Dr. Bowering and Stu just said. I'll also add, since nuclear was mentioned, I don't think that's something that the state of Pennsylvania needs to do, but I do think it's a very important part of the solution. Constellation has a very large nuclear fleet. We produce 10% of the clean electricity in the United States, or the largest producer of clean electricity, and a generous portion of that is from nuclear. We're looking to extend the life of our resources with subsequent license renewal. We are studying very hard to look at what uprates we can bring on, both in PJM and elsewhere, but two-thirds of our fleet is here in PJM. And we're now looking forward at other opportunities, whether that's hosting small modular reactors on our site or looking into development of them ourselves. We think nuclear is definitely an enormous part of the solution going forward. Thank you.
On that point, the nuclear point, I'm curious about whether the competitive market is going to be able to build any more nuclear. Right now, the generators are extending the licenses on units that were built with ratepayer money. And I'm just very curious about whether the market, as it is set up right now, will ever be able to take on the risk of breaking ground on a brand new nuclear facility.
So I'll say the markets didn't value TMI's attributes, right? But as Stu pointed out, the markets are spot market, and we have bilateral transactions. And a tech partner does value our attributes, and it's not breaking ground, but it's a pretty significant investment, $1.6 billion to bring TMI back as the Crane Clean Energy Center. And I think we have opportunities for other partnerships to allow development of nuclear going forward.
One other quick example, I'm sure we've all seen, at least 2 public announcements of data center developers partnering with entities to develop small modular reactors. That is another form of market response, absolutely, because they know they need their megawatts, and they're willing to put money into developing what they believe is sort of the next generation. So it's another opportunity for nuclear to enter the mix.
Right, and that's, I guess, just to follow up Vice Chair's question, Adrian, that large-scale nuclear, I mean, we haven't seen that anywhere other than Georgia, I think, it was a vertically regulated state. Would we see that kind of development in a restructured state compared to small modular nuclear? Or are we simply small modular nuclear is the nuclear in restructured states? That's the question.
I think small modular is probably the answer. This is just Adrian's thoughts. I thought it was the answer when I was at PJM in 2008, and we were about to see what people were then calling a nuclear renaissance. There were some events that occurred that changed that, but I think that we're seeing it again. And the reason we're seeing it is there's a demand for electricity, there's a demand for baseload power, and there's a valuing of the full attributes in the clean electricity. And so those are things that have changed. And so Adrian's thoughts are that the future is small modular.
So once again, Pennsylvania led the way with Hyman Rickover, Shippingsport, right? The first modular nuclear reactor, took it right out of a submarine, put it on a concrete platform and ran it for 30 years in Pennsylvania. So that was the first small nuclear, small modular, very safe, very safe. They take them in nuclear submarines.
Did not know that. All right. We are nearing time. Diane?
As a NERC regional entity, we really can't solution along with you, but I do want to just make the point, and I want to thank the Commission, because if we're going to get to an optimal solution, it's convening these types of conferences and getting all the interested parties together, listening to each other and understanding the challenges so that we can come up with the appropriate solution. So thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you. Travis?
Maybe just two quick ones on the demand and customer side, because those are the things you've got exclusive jurisdiction on. The first, I think, is considering whether the rate design for default products should be time of use. Like I said at the beginning, certain time of use products qualify for price responsive demand that lowers the overall capacity requirement of a particular entity. And there used to be a chairman of this very commission who, wondering about whether he should authorize AMI spending, asked whether it was pointless to have smart meters but dumb rates. A man known for his outspoken nature. And I think that was a prophetic statement that we should probably heed. Unfortunately, adoption of the opt-in TOU rates in Pennsylvania remains very low. And the second point, most states in PJM now have, in addition to trying to nudge this behavioral change around demand, smart thermostat programs. And increasingly you're seeing, and I'll cite AEP Ohio as an example, a desire to make sure those are co-optimized with the people who are actually supplying the energy and capacity. So they're dispatching not just for distribution peaks, but making sure they provide some contribution as aggregated demand response for capacity value, or reducing costs by avoiding those 5 coincident peaks for adopting customers on which basis capacity is charged. So those are two things, and they're not going to solve we're not talking about thousands and thousands of megawatts, but we are talking about potential demand reductions of 10% of the capacity needs of the residential customer class that can be adopted a lot quicker than a lot of the supply side solutions.
Travis, that's one of the things I talk about all the time is we have to use all the tools in the toolbox that we have, and stay tuned on time of use. You may be seeing something out of us soon.
Marjorie?
Well, I don't usually like to talk about my age, but I was in the room when PJM first started as a LMP, just a real-time market, and when Pennsylvania took the leadership. Remember, most of the folks at PJM came from PECO, who was where I was with at the time. And Pennsylvania showed extraordinary leadership, both in the formation of PJM and in deregulation. And I think my first recommendation to you is to stay more active and influential in OPSI and PJM. We have seen PJM become a little politicized, and there are states that pursue different policies that have less of the richness of resources that Pennsylvania has. And you just need to make sure your thumb is on the scale so that the actions are not to accommodate a particular state policy, but what is best for the market. And I think the fact that you are exporting as many megawatts as you are today is actually reflective of that. So that's my first recommendation. You know I'm bossy, so I have a couple more. Two is, I think you could work better with your transmission owners to understand the data center load. So we've been looking, for example, at the utilities who, it's hard, right? It's really hard. You don't know what's real. But for example, there are utilities that are reporting to PJM one number that they see for load, and they're telling their states it's another number. And there's not a lot of transparency, and that load forecast is critical because you overstate it, you overprocure, prices go up, you understate it, and we have a reliability issue. So I think working to ensure a little bit more rules of the road and discipline about how we assess the load coming on the system is going to be good for Pennsylvania, good for consumers, and good for PJM's planning. Three, you know, everybody talks about, what is it, clean, reliable, and affordable. And I'm afraid that is one wobbly stool because it's really hard to have all three. And we have not been honest to our customers and ratepayers about the cost of this transition. And it isn't free. And so I think the most important, and you know, we talk about a nuclear, yeah, you could, Pennsylvania could, you know, tell one of your utilities to go out, and you saw what happened with Vogtle. I don't know how many years late and billions of dollars of overrun, and if you want affordability, the market will get you a much better approach than that one, I think. But I do think it's really critical that we be honest and think creatively about retail rates, if not this year, but how you can make the respect that it's going to have a cost, but also figure out how you can help people who are impacted most negatively from the cost. So those would be my recommendations.
Thank you. Tom?
Hey, thanks. Okay, first off, winterize the gas plants. Use every authority you can scrape up under the CPCNs to winterize and strongly encourage dual fueling. Work with the legislature to winterize the wellheads. Wellhead freezing was about a third of the gas outages during the last winter storm. Do everything you can to make distribution level storage as easy as possible in Pennsylvania. That's one of the best ways to go around the interconnection queue. Regarding data centers that wish to bring their own gen, do everything you can to make sure that's additive. If you allow them to simply buy existing gen off the system, they're simply dumping the resource adequacy and queue problems on the general public. And as far as nukes go, you know, Constellation is about as well suited as anyone to pull a rabbit out of the hat at 3 Mile Island. But the industry in general doesn't have a great record on timing, and so that's an awful risky basket to be putting all your eggs in.
Thank you. Thank you to all of my panelists. We are over by 5 minutes, but y'all have been great. So we are going to, this concludes session 1, and we're going to break for 10 minutes. Return by 11. We're going to start without you. The restrooms are on the plaza level towards Forster Street.